Hi everyone, I want to welcome you to another table talk. As the title says, today's discussion is going to be about different tapes and glues that I use during the construction of my park jets. Now, pardon the horrible pun, but I know that glue can be a very sticky subject amongst builders. I know when I was on the RC Powers forum, I remember seeing guys just about fight to the death over what the best glue was. So I'm not here to tell you use this glue because it's the absolute best. It's because these are glues that I've experimented with a lot of different glues over time, and I find that these work the best for me. Primarily because I can get them all except one, which I'll talk about, that I don't really use much anymore. I can buy locally at a hardware store, craft store, dollar store. They're affordable. There might be glues that are available to you, but maybe because of getting them shipped to you makes them not affordable. And I think the most important is just what works for you. What works for your building style, that sort of stuff. So anyway, I always like to keep an open mind anyway. There are certain products that I haven't tried, I know, that are popular, like Yoo-Hoo Pour, things like that. But I try and keep an open mind, always looking for better build materials, build techniques, and especially if it gives me equal or better performance and still stays cheap. So I'm just going to talk about, again, primarily what's worked for me. Maybe these will give you new ideas on things that you might try. So anyway, I'll start off by talking about tape. So I use several different types of tape. This is a fiberglass strapping tape. I get this from Staples, which is an office supply store, and it has, you can see here, like a thin fiberglass strips running down the length of the tape. Might even be easier to see here on a piece of black foam. Now I'm going to have a blog post written to support this video, so you'll be able to see close-up pictures and links to certain things. Like I said, most of the stuff I can buy, but I have found links primarily on Amazon.com if you're interested in checking it out or experimenting. So what I use this fiberglass strapping tape for is on the inside of score lines. On a score and fold park jet, you score downway through the foam, and then you put tape on the other side and then crack it. So you need some tape to act as a hinge for reinforcement, and also again to act as a hinge. So this is what I found works really best. Again, I get this at a local office supply store, but I have found a similar product on Amazon. One thing I will say I found out the hard way is the glue on this. I had a roll of this actually in my flight box for a while to use for quick field repairs, and the heat actually dried out all the adhesive and all the glue. So I don't carry this around in my flight box anymore for that reason. But it's got a really good adhesive, and it's nice and strong, and it works really well for score and fold applications on my park jets. Alright, this is 3M Tough Scotch brand transparent duct tape, and I use this for my hinges. I know a lot of guys use 3M Extreme packing tape. I can't get that here in Canada, or if I can, it's just cost prohibitive. So actually I'll show you here. I actually had sanded this part here, you can see is sanded, because I used a stretch of it to put for the battery bay door on my RC Powers T50 version 5. So you can see that this has fairly thick fibers running widthwise, and then some thinner fibers running lengthwise, and it has really good strong adhesive. Here's what it looks like. Maybe it's easier to see on the black foam there. So I use this for all my hinges. Like you say, it does have a very shiny finish to it. So if you want to paint over top of it, if you paint over top of it while it's shiny on the hinges, the paint will just crack and fall off. But I found if you take like a 150 grit or 220 grit sandpaper and just lightly scuff it, take all that shine off it, that the paint will stay on it really easily. This stuff, I've had it on planes for over 300 flights. You know, I store my airplanes outside in the garage, so you know they've been stored and flown. You know, as cold as like -5 Celsius and as warm as +30 Celsius. And touch wood, I've never had a hinge come apart on me. So it's really good stuff. I've also experimented with the Duck, D-U-C-K brand Duct Tape, and it's good tape. It's a little bit cheaper, but I don't find that the adhesive holds up as well. So I'm able to get this stuff at Home Depot and other local hardware stores. But again, I'll have a link to a similar product from Amazon. This is fiberglass, you know, just your fiberglass drywall tape. It's got a bit of adhesive on the one side. It's a mesh tape. What I use this for is that in the areas, let's say along the bottom of an electronics bay on a plane, let's say, you know, you want a little bit of reinforcement there, because when you're putting the battery in, pulling the battery out, sometimes that bottom of that battery bay on the outside, it'll start to flex. So if you want to give it a little bit of extra strength, what I've done is I've taken a piece of this, spread it out, and then used, I'll talk some more about this glue, but this is like, this is foam cure. It dries quite hard, just like an epoxy. So I'll put a few beads of that on, and then take some scrap foam, and then just, you know, squeegee it down real thin, and it makes sort of like a poor man's fiberglass if you want. So that works really well. Fiberglass drywall tape for reinforcing. Excuse me, just gotta grab my coffee here. So a couple different types of masking tape. This is some cheap painter's masking tape that I get at the dollar store. This stuff has a pretty decent adhesive on it. If I like to tape pieces together, like you know, when I'm building noses and fuselages and things like that. You know, I want to tape them together while the glue cures. This has a strong enough adhesive to hold them together, you know, even if they're curved, let's say on a nose where they're curved and they're under tension and wanting to pop back. It has enough adhesive to hold those, but it doesn't have too much adhesive so that it leaves a residue on the foam. So it takes a little bit of experimentation to sort of find that right combination. I've found that it's, you know, it's strong enough that it'll hold it for a couple hours while the glue dries, but then doesn't leave a big glob of any kind of residue on the foam, which is tough to get off or makes your plane not look so good. However, it's not really good, even though it's painter's masking tape, because it's, you know, it's pretty cheap stuff from the dollar store. It's not good if you want to mask a plane when you're painting it and you want a nice straight line. I found that sort of no matter how hard I press down on it, paint will still bleed underneath it. So for that purpose, I use this stuff. This is a higher quality that I get at Home Depot. This is like a 3M professional painter's masking tape, and you know, if I want a nice straight line when I'm painting my plane, this is the stuff that I've used. What I also will use this for is, I find sometimes, for me anyway, back when I was testing planes for NAMC, I used to just put a couple of strips of this stuff on wing tips. You know, just to give me, you know, if I knew I was going to paint the plane but I didn't have the time to paint it and I wanted to get out and maiden it, this stuff will stick on really well. It does leave a little bit of a mark, but if you're careful with some 220 sandpaper, you can sand that off. So, so those are the tapes that I use. Okay, for glues, I still use good old hot glue. You know, hot glue kind of got a bit of demonized a while back when a lot of, you know, lighter, better glues came out. But I think that hot glue it still has a really, still has its role in how I build anyway. Primarily what I use hot glue for, and this is just an inexpensive low temp glue gun that I got from, I think from Walmart. I had a high temp glue gun before, and what I found was that I ended up melting the foam sometimes, or I had to be super careful. So I find that for what I use it for, that low temp works just fine, and I just buy these little mini sticks. Now again, I know hot glue got demonized, and because it is heavy, so you do have to be careful. Each one of these little sticks weighs about 4 grams. But what I like to use it for is sort of spot welding. You know, if I've got like the two pieces of a nose, let's say, that are coming together, the two tips, is I will sort of dry fit them, and then what I do is I'll just put the tiniest little dab of this hot glue sort of in between the two tips, and then hold it, and then what it does is it sort of spot welds those two pieces together, because those fine tips out at the front of the nose, it's really hard to sort of pin those and tape those together to get them to hold the right shape. But if you sort of just give it a little spot weld with some hot glue, it seems to work really, really well. Also, what I've done on the inside, like let's say between my fingers here is a seam on the inside of the plane, is I'll run a very, very thin bead on the inside of a seam, like especially on the nose. Maybe you can't see that. On the inside of the nose like that, and then right away take a piece of scrap foam and just squeegee as much away. Not only to reduce weight, but it drives the hot glue down into the seam and spreads it out and creates a really strong bond. The other thing I use it for is my servos. I like to use hot glue on my servos. I'll put wrap tape around my servos and then use this. I just find if I crash a plane and I want to reuse the servos, I just find that hot glue comes off, a lot more easily than say epoxy or some other glue. So that's what I use it for. So I might use quarter to a half a stick when I build a plane. So it just makes my life so much easier, especially being with a little hot weld application. So hot glue is definitely very handy. All right, the main glue that I build with, this is called Bob Smith Industries Foam Cure. Bob Smith Industries, or BSI, has been around the hobby, producing adhesives for the hobby industry for a very, very long time. And Hobby King has sold this under license. And this is was quite inexpensive at one time. It's 4 fluid ounces. I think it used to cost me about $5 American. And then a while ago it got put on some kind of dangerous shipping list. So it was becoming more and more expensive. So luckily I found this. This is called Craft Medley Premium Craft Glue. And again, I'll have pictures in the supporting blog so you can see this a little easier. Luckily I found this at my local Dollar Tree. And it looks like, smells like, I won't say it tastes like, I don't want to do that, but it works exactly the same as this Bob Smith Industries foam cure. This is a 1.7 ounce bottle, and I get it for $1.25 Canadian, so about $1, just under $1 American, and I can get it locally. So if you can find this, if you live in North America and have a Dollar Tree store close to you, or maybe you find this, I think I did find a place one time maybe even in New Zealand, so it may be available overseas in certain places. I haven't been able to find it online anywhere in North America. I did find a place, I think, a while ago in New Jersey, but they only wanted to deal with people that were vendors that wanted to buy like boxes of 25 or 50 bottles at a time. But this stuff works really well. It dries the same consistency as epoxy, but lighter. It also dries clear. And it can be sanded. It's not as easy to sand as the foam, but it doesn't pill. I've used other glues that were more flexible that when I pulled the fan paper across, they would pill and then sometimes pull right out of the seam. So this stuff is sandable, dries very light. It does take a while to dry though. Like especially on fuselages where I've got the foam bent and I've got it taped together. I'll let it probably set up for at least a good 2 hours before I pull the tape off. It does need exposure to air to really cure properly. So for foam to foam applications, like even if I'm doing like a butt joint, it works just fine because there's enough bubbles and gaps in the foam that air can get to it and dry. But this works really, really well. If I did, let's say, a whole lot of gluing, like I'm mating a fuselage and a wing plate together and I've got all kinds of seams that I've glued, then normally what I'll do is I'll actually leave it overnight to dry, just to make sure it dries good and hard and solid. But this has worked really, really well for me, and if I'm careful, I can build 2 airplanes out of 1 bottle of this stuff. So it's exactly the same. If you can't get that stuff, it's the same as this Bob Smith Industries foam cure, which might be less expensive where you live, but that's the main glue that I build with. Excuse me. Okay, so good old 5-minute epoxy. I get these at the buck store, I think for $1.25, $1.50 maybe. There's 25 mils in here. If I'm really, really careful, I can get 2 planes, sometimes close to 3 out of one of these. So you've got your plunger, you know, a hardener, and your resin in this plunger. You pop the bottom off, and what I do is I just squeeze out a little bit on a bit of wax paper, take a toothpick, stir it up, make sure that the two components are really well mixed. So where I use this is anything where that's not foam to foam. So reinforcement going into the foam, like carbon fiber, bamboo skewers, my control horns, my motor mount. I use this stuff because it dries pretty quick. You know, within 5, 10, 15 minutes. Normally, it's like super rock hard, and it doesn't require exposure to air because it's a chemical reaction to harden. The reason that I started using these is I used to buy like the bigger 4-ounce, you know, you got hardener in one, resin in the other. Is I used to buy those from either Hobby King or even my local hardware store, and what I started to find happening was, you know, one or both of them, after they've been sitting in the bottle for a very, very long time, because I didn't, you know, use them up as much, they would start to go crystal or get really, really thick, and it would make it hard to use. So in the long term, these are probably cheaper than buying it in the big bottles. I think the last time I checked is that good quality 5-minute epoxy at the hardware store for 2 4-ounce bottles was going to cost me around $15. So I think pretty in the long run. The other nice thing is I actually have one of these in my flight box. So if I need to do a little bit of repair at the field that requires epoxy, I just use one of these. It's made in China, so it compared to some other epoxies, it's got a pretty strong smell to it. But again, it works really well for control horns, mortar mounts, and putting reinforcement in the foam. That's what I use epoxy for. Okay, I did this a bit. This is actually the glue that I use when I'm getting ready to start a build to put the plans down on the foam. This is Elmers Craft Bond. It's a spray adhesive, and you know, it holds the plans on there nice and firm, but even after a day or so, you can still peel the paper off pretty easily. The trick is to use, you know, a really fine mist, and the other trick is with both these spray adhesives is making sure that after you're done using it, if there's any residue on this nozzle, is to make sure that that gets cleaned off. Because if not, what I've had happen is, you know, I go to use it, you know, shake it up, spray it, and then it comes out really erratically, and then what I end up, especially when I'm putting plans down on the foam, is I end up with a great big blob of it coming out. And then when I put the plans down on the foam, you know, it can be really hard to get them off afterwards because I've got a great big blob of glue there. So, but this is the stuff that I use to put my plans down on the foam before I cut the parts out. Okay, this is the stuff, 3M Super 77 spray adhesive. I think I have a link. You can get this on Amazon, but it's, you know, whether they'll ship it to you because it's an aerosol can, I don't know. But I get this at Home Depot. This is what I use to put my KF airfoils down. So what I'll do is I'll spread out a bunch of, you know, a few strips of wax paper. Wax paper works better for me in this application because when I'm spraying, if I get some overspray and it gets underneath, is when I go to lift the airfoil up and then put it on the plane, is that it doesn't tend to stick. You know, if I was using, say, newspaper or cardboard, it can start to tack up pretty quick. I think it says on the label it starts tacking up in like 10 to 15 seconds. So the wax paper, because of the wax on it, it doesn't tend to stick to that as easily and allows me to pull it up. So what I do is that, you know, I spray a good even film of that on my airfoils, put it down on my plane, and I go along with, you know, sort of with the flat of my hand and make sure that I press it down, because if the foam is bowed at all, what you don't want to have happen is, you know, you've got any air pockets underneath there. So I just go along and press it down, and then I'll tape the edges. I normally build my planes with KF4s, so I'll tape the edges down, and again make sure that it's good and lots of good firm contact. And like I said, it starts to tack up pretty quickly. Now when I do that for my KFs, because I like to shape the front of my KFs, I normally will do that, start off with a sharp razor knife and then sand. So what I do is, even though it says on the label it's, you know, probably fully dry within an hour, is I will leave that overnight, because what I don't want to have happen is I start cutting in with my knife and the glue can still be a little bit gummy after an hour or two, because, you know, you've put so much such a wide area of it down. So I leave it overnight before I start doing that, because if the blade on your knife starts to gum up, even if it's brand new and sharp, it can start to tear the foam or just make a real mess. So I always, when I use this for my KF airfoils, I always leave it overnight to dry. All right, this is the last glue that I use. This is expanding Gorilla Glue. I think you can get it in white as well. So what this does is it kind of foams. I think it increases. I've sort of checked it. It expands about 10 times in volume, but when it dries, it's super strong, and it's good for filling any gaps or anything. So what I do, this is my T50 here that I just finished building. Now you can see it looks like, you know, my plane got blobbed or slimed here, but what I do is sort of in the motor mount is I put a little bit along the edge of the motor mount and along all the edges of the motor mount. So if there's any gaps in there where, you know, the epoxy didn't happen to bond, or, you know, because of how I've had to orient the motor mount to get it, you know, nice and true and square, I'll put a little tiny bit of that down. You can also see here, especially I find on these planes that I've built with Dollar Tree foam, is underneath where this blob is. It might be hard to see. Again, I'll have a close-up picture of it in the blog post. Is I'll put some down along there, because what I have found happening is that sometimes this foam gets a little bit flexible in this area, and where it is on the carbon, there's a carbon spar that goes through here, is that sometimes it can start to flex on that and pull away. So by putting some of that expanding Gorilla Glue down there, when that foams up and dries, it just makes it super strong. And, you know, you've got the door there, so it's not, you know, look like you're looking at a big horrible messy glob of glue all the time. But it's definitely worth it, because it's super strong. So how I apply this stuff is, again, I just take a little bit of wax paper, put a little blob down, and then I take toothpicks, and it likes moisture to you know, to activate it and accelerate it. So I'll just take a toothpick, you know, put it in my mouth, and then once the toothpick is nice and wet, I'll just put it in the glue, and then you want to spread it really, you know, thin. You just need a very thin thin layer along the seams, because like I said, it expands about 10 times what you put down when it fully dries. And then, you know, keep doing that. Obviously, don't stick the toothpick that you've just used back in your mouth. Throw that away. Get another toothpick. Again, I buy my toothpicks at the buck store, so they're dirt cheap and they're biodegradable. So yeah, don't make that mistake. I almost have, which would have been really. Some people would have been happy, because I might end up gluing my big yap shut. But anyway, this works really well for filling those gaps around the motor mount and really strengthening the area around the motor mount. Expanding Gorilla Glue. So there we go, folks. Like I said, lots of you know, lots of different products. You know, one of these things where you know, lots of different glues, but, you know, they all sort of have their role that they play. And you know, because of their strengths in certain areas, they're better to use. Like, for example, the hot glue, because it, you know, essentially hardens within a few seconds. It's perfect for, you know, doing those little spot welds, so that I can go back with other lighter, stronger glues and fill the seams, while the hot glue is holding things in place. So again, you know, not trying to convert anybody here to the products that I build with. Just, these are things that, you know, experimenting with several different glues over the years, these are what currently are working for me the best. So I will link, again, a blog post down below with more pictures and other links and information on these tapes and glues, and I hope that this has been helpful. I encourage you, you know, if you use a different glue, please, you know, leave your comments and experiences down below. Like I said, I'm always looking for different ideas or different things to try out, you know, and hear your experiences with what you've used. So thanks very much for watching. Blue skies, calm winds to everyone. Park jet noise, the other sound of freedom, baby. Take care.